With each passing year, Kevin Durant continues to add to one of the most consistent and complete careers the game of basketball has ever seen. Last season, at age 35, he was 6th in the NBA at nearly 2,800 minutes played and was named to his 11th All-NBA team. 14 years after he made his first All-NBA team in 2010, when he became the youngest scoring champion ever, averaging over 30 points a game at just age 21. He then went on to defend his scoring title not once, but twice before snagging a 4th in his historic MVP season, where he made it very clear that we had never seen a scorer anything like this. We'd seen all-time great shooters like Ray Allen and Reggie Miller before. We'd seen mid-range assassins like Kobe Bryant and Dirk Nowitzki. We'd seen explosive slashers like Michael Jordan and Dwayne Wade. What we hadn't seen was someone excel from all 3 levels in the way a young Kevin Durant did, and up until that Jones fracture altered his athleticism a bit heading into the 2015 season, I think it's safe to say that we were looking at the most versatile scorer in NBA history. Durant's true height has always been a mystery. Back then, you'd hear 6'9", which we all knew was a lie, and many will tell you that he's actually a legit 7-footer. Nowadays, he's officially listed on the Suns roster as 6'11", which I think is pretty accurate and would make him as tall as a lot of teams' starting centers, even back in the early 2010s. What's even crazier is the sheer length though. His 7'5" wingspan puts him in a rare class historically, and some incredibly long legs enable him to cover virtually the entire court in as little as just a few strides. This absurd length, when paired with the agility and burst of a young KD, helped turn him into one of the game's most lethal transition scorers. In many ways, his open floor game reminds me of Giannis, one of the biggest guys pushing the ball down the middle with speed and using his length to get to the rim with ease. Of course, KD never had the sheer power or strength of Giannis, but I'm more focused on the explosiveness and how he'd use his strides to counter different defensive looks. If a defender met him early to slow the push, he could gather from outside the paint and still rely on those exaggerated steps to get to a layup. Or he could actually use his live dribble to create those openings, often going to hesitations and crossovers to leave defenders in the dust. The size and athletic tools, when paired with his handle, made him a true one-man fast break, capable of taking on entire defenses and still finding ways to get to the rim. In the rare event that the defense was able to get back and prevent him from touching the paint, he'd of course stop on a dime for a pull-up jumper. I'm not just talking about from inside the arc either. If he had enough room, he'd pull up for the ever so controversial transition 3, and if he was away from the ball or trailing the play, he was actively hunting for these types of shots. That's because, without question, KD is one of NBA history's most effective off-the-catch three-point shooters. It doesn't matter if he's above the break, in either corner, from any spot on the perimeter, he's an imminent threat, and he'll make defenses pay for leaving him open. The thing is, an open shot for Durant isn't like an open shot for most shooters as a result of his absurdly high release point. You'll have plays like this where Matt Barnes makes a perfectly timed closeout, he just forgets to get a hand up on the near 7-foot sniper. Or how about this one where Anthony Tolliver, a big forward, does manage to get a hand up, and it's like he's not even there. We don't have catch and shoot numbers from before 2014, but since then, he's been incredibly efficient on these shots throughout the course of his career, only falling below 38% once, consistently landing over 40, and peaking at nearly 50% in a season with the Warriors. I know I said we don't have these numbers for his earlier years, but what we do have is his overall three-point percentage, and you'll notice that tends to correlate pretty well with how well he shot off the catch. Considering how efficient he was from deep in both 2012 and 2013, I think we can reasonably assume that his catch and shoot numbers were pretty good. And because of that ability to just shoot over the top of any closeouts, he pretty much had unlimited access to these looks anytime he wanted, so he'd hunt for them with his off-ball movement. Sometimes it's as subtle as filling out space along the perimeter to find slight openings, which he'd of course take advantage of, but an underrated aspect of his outside shooting is how good he was on the move, meaning that the Thunder could implement screening action with the intention of getting him a good look from three. And when I say on the move, I mean to both his left and right, unlocking so much flexibility within that OKC offense. Recently, I've been playing Prize Picks a lot, and I had no idea just how much it could enhance the experience of watching sports. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. Join 5 million users and sign up today, as you can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. Even better, there's a big time bonus going on. Sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to get the $50 bonus, it's guaranteed. On Prize Picks, I'm personally looking at the football lines, which includes 1 Caleb Williams passing yard for 1 win during the entire month of September. That's right, only 1 yard gets you an automatic win every football weekend in September. Don't miss this deal on Prize Picks because it's gone when the month ends. As for some other opening week lines, I also really like 97.5 receiving yards for Tyreek Hill and 33.5 rushing yards for Kyler Murray. It's as simple as selecting more or less on the stats you want and watching how they play out on the big screen. Download the app today and use code HoopVenue to get $50 instantly after you play $5. Again, download the app and use code HoopVenue to get $50 instantly after you play $5. Prize Picks, run your game. With that said, let's take a look at some of the set actions that the Thunder would run for Durant. More times than not, he'd start possessions near the baseline and they'd bring him towards the ball with a down screen to which he'd make an instant read off the catch. I know I highlighted his shooting ability from deep, but he did most of his work in the mid-range area, where if he didn't have a shot right away, he'd use 1 or 2 dribbles to hunt for a little bit more space. And this is really tough to cover, because when he flies off that screen, not only does the defense have to worry about him rising up for a jumper, but also him turning the corner on his way to the rim. So the obvious counter is to not let him receive that catch, right? Well, if a defender ever tried to top lock the side of the screen, Durant would just seal off the paint for an easy catch and finish. He and Westbrook had incredible chemistry on these plays, so he'd get a great deal of free points off of these backdoor lobs. In general, he was just a remarkable cutter. The threat of him coming off that screen into open space, when paired with his agility and how he'd juke his defender, again led to lots of easy buckets. It was the same thing whenever they'd set up handoffs. His defenders trying to deny him the ball, and with a simple fake, he's exploding backdoor for points at the rim. Then as soon as his defender worries too much about the backdoor, letting him receive the handoff while going under the screen, well, I'm sure we all know how that goes. If he wasn't starting on the baseline, he was probably starting on the elbow, to which they'd run him off of cross screens for some more of those quick hitting jumpers. Another interesting wrinkle they added though was using these cross screens as a decoy. Instead of trying to free up for a jumper, Durant's gonna turn into the screener himself before slipping into open space where Westbrook finds him for a big time finish. They actually used KD as a screener a lot more than I think people remember, and he could really counter anything the defense threw at him as a roller. If he caught the ball in the short roll and the help was late coming over, he'd utilize his length with some of those sharp strides. If he caught the ball in the short roll and the help was early, that created a mismatch to which he'd attack without wasting a fraction of a second. And if that wasn't tough enough to defend, he was an even bigger threat to pop out to the three-point line after screening. Again, there wasn't much the defense could do to limit these opportunities. Even if help got there in time on the closeout, he'd rise right over the top with ease. The key here is that because of his unique physical profile and ability to shoot the lights out of the ball, there was absolutely no shortage of ways he could be used as an off-ball weapon. And as a result, the guy never stopped moving. He was always filling out space, running around screens, slipping screens himself. Then after getting the ball, his decisions were always instant. Even if he started with the ball, after getting rid of it, he'd either immediately cut or relocate to a different spot on the floor. You can't lose the guy because he's a threat to score as long as he's checked into the game. And if you're thinking about helping and recovering, think again, because not only would he shoot over the top of any closeout, he'd destroy them on drives to the basket. Sometimes though, he'd attack a closeout successfully only to run into a packed paint. That's when the pull-up jumper took over. This right here is probably the most notable and infamous aspect of Kevin Durant's game. For all of the off-ball wizardry, the freak mobility and fluidity at his size, it's his off-the-dribble shooting that truly stands out above all. I wouldn't say he was quite the mid-range scorer a decade ago that he is now, because nobody is, but he was still among the best of the best back then, hitting around 45% of these shots at great volume. The defense had to respect it. If he came off a ball screen and saw a deep drop coverage, that was like a layup to him. If he was working in isolation and not one but two defenders smothered him, well, there's that absurdly high release point. In my opinion, he was undoubtedly at his best as an off-the-dribble shooter inside the arc, but don't think he couldn't step out and bury the pull-up three. Again, we don't have pull-up shooting numbers before 2014, but that was his MVP year where he had to take more on-ball responsibility and attempted considerably more unassisted threes than in any previous season. Of course, times were different back then, so instead of having a bunch of guys taking 6, 7, 8 pull-up threes a game, Steph Curry led the NBA by a decent margin at 5 attempts. Durant wasn't too far behind at about 3, but he was actually more efficient, hitting just under 41% of these opportunities. That shot is a total game changer, especially when it comes to attacking out of the pick and roll. Because of that release point, if his defender goes under the screen, he might as well just be handing him a quality look. And the same goes for the positioning of the big. If he's sitting back in a drop, KD is going to take and make that shot with a great deal of consistency. So more times than not, bigs had to come up and meet him at the level of the screen. And I mean at the level. Nene is up near it, but doesn't commit to the ball and gets a triple to the eye. The problem with bigs coming up to the level though, is that when they jump out, they're leaving themselves vulnerable to plays like this, as KD happens to be a pretty explosive slasher. I talked about the burst and agility. Those really stand out when it comes to attacking slower-footed players in space. Just like in transition, he'll use his length to really exaggerate his handle, whether that means a hesitation or a crossover or a combination of the two, and once he gets the step, there's no chance of recovering. So it's imperative that he's met with resistance before ever coming off the screen. Somebody has to be pre-positioned and ready to close that space. Then the point of attack defender has to protect the opposite side because he's also a threat to reject the screen. Oftentimes what you'll see him do is spam those hesitations and crosses over and over again until he finds an opening. From there, his length allows him to just eat up space. Even on a play like this where his defender is expecting him to reject the screen and does a great job of staying in front, he's able to stop on a dime before redirecting into a new lane. I can't stress enough how absurd it is that he's able to move with the level of fluidity he does at that size. We've seen freak athletes at 7 feet. Finding one with that much control and balance while still being explosive is a complete outlier though, and when you pair that with the ball handling skills of a small guard, you're left with someone who could pretty much get wherever he wanted. As a result of being so tall and lengthy, his handle was never the tightest, and he was somewhat susceptible to ball pressure, but being able to cover so much ground is also what made him so deadly. All he really needed was a nice hesitation, that vicious crossover, and great timing for when and where to make his move. Because he was so quick to process the defense and react, that meant staying in front of him was more than a one-man task. His go-to was this hanging left-hand hesitation. If he had space to take that first step, he'd explode on a drive left. And what made this move so effective is that he could also use it to get into one of those pull-up triples. So it became a game of read and react. If he hesitated and his defender dropped back on the drive, he'd shoot right over the top of them. But if his defender bit on the pull-up threat and put a hand up, he'd start his attack where the rest of the defense was at his mercy. Durant was never the highest volume driver on the planet, but he blended the perimeter shooting with interior scoring very well during his younger days. Whereas now he'll only get to the rim for 2, maybe 3 attempts a game, back in OKC he was typically closer to 4 or 5, which might not sound like a big difference, but gives his scoring a much higher floor when you consider how good he was at converting. In the 2014 season, he made 77.5% of his shots at the rim, third in the NBA behind just Brandon Wright and LeBron James. For a much larger sample, we could look at the first 5 years of the 2010s decade, and he still made a very impressive 73.3%, good for third behind those same two guys. I feel like KD's not remembered much for his in-game dunking, but if he had space to leap off of 1 foot, he'd put anybody on a poster. And I mean anybody. Roy Hibbert was arguably the game's best rim protector at the time, and KD punched it on his head. It was imperative that whoever was coming over to help wasn't late, because if he had enough space to take off vertically, he'd end up doing things like this. Help had to meet him early, taking away that 1 foot leap. But not too early, because then he'd go back to using his length to carve out a finishing angle from the floor. Or the two would work together on a play like this, where he steps around the first helper before taking off to put a second one on a poster. With that said, these powerful finishes only accounted for a fraction of his interior scoring. For Durant, it was more about his buttery soft touch. I talked about his stupidly long arms. Those gave him an unlimited amount of angles to sneak the ball around rim protectors for some of the purest finger rolls you'll ever see. I mean, seriously, the audacity to even attempt something like this, let alone kiss it off the glass with precision, is just unheard of. So he was tough to stay in front of. The way he paired the threat of his pull-up shooting with that burst, agility, and handle led to many great drives. After beating his man, he was even tougher to stop from scoring, as he could get above the rim, go reverse, adjust his shot to any angle with elite touch. In short, he was one of the game's best interior scorers. But even on those plays where he started to drive, yet wasn't quite able to create an angle to the rim, he had all of the answers. Like I said earlier, his go-to was that hanging left-hand hesitation. He could also throw that straight into a crossover, and if his defender thought drive, he'd pull up for a jumper. Of course, he could do the same, but reversed. A right-hand hesitation into a cross left before stepping back for a bit more space on the jumper. The key here is that no matter how well the defense plays his initial move, because of his size, he could always get a shot up over the top of them. And as a result of being one of the best shooters ever, it's not like he's forcing these looks or even settling. These are efficient shots that lead to good team offense. That's why he needed less space to operate than arguably any other all-time great scorer. He'd go into the playoffs with multiple non-shooters on the floor, a loaded paint, and yet time and time again he found ways to produce. This especially stood out whenever he faced up from inside the arc. He'd use jab steps to threaten the drive, and all he needed was an inch of space to rise up for one of his mid-range layups. On this one, Parsons reacts to a jab right, and that's all it takes for KD to essentially get a warm-up jumper. And here's a real similar play, except J.R. Smith overplays the jumper, so KD uses that jab right as his first step to create an open dunk. He could take that first step in either direction. Here's one where he jabs right before driving left, with the exact same result, and all of those same rules I talked about earlier still apply. If the help is late, good luck. If he takes that first step and the paint is packed, he's gonna find quality offense over the top of his defender. Turnaround jumpers were actually a very big part of his arsenal, which stood out whenever he decided to play out of the mid-post. He had a little bit of Dirk to his game, often going to this right shoulder bump, one-legged fall-away jumper, and sometimes he'd add one dribble to this move for a little bit more separation. What stood out most about his back-to-the-basket scoring, though, is how comfortable he was turning over either shoulder for these fadeaways. Take this game against the Blazers, for example. Their strategy was to send help from the middle of the floor, to which he'd counter by spinning in the opposite direction to set up his jumper. And it didn't matter what side he started on. The double comes, he turns baseline and makes it look routine. Over and over again they tried this, and they knew how he'd counter, but it just didn't matter. To be honest though, that's pretty much the story of a young Kevin Durant's scoring arsenal. For a lot of all-time great scorers, you can pinpoint one type of play that they mastered. For guys like Shaq and Kareem, it was all about post-ups. For a guy like Steph, it was all about screens, whether that be out of pick and roll or flying around away from the ball. Kobe and MJ had the triangle offense that featured lots of isolations, and don't even get me started on what James Harden was doing in the late 2010s. But I think what stands out about Kevin Durant is the sheer versatility in how he'd get his points and how easily it came within the flow of his team's offense. He'd get some points in transition, maybe a three or two while spotting up, some jumpers off of screens, a couple backdoor cuts, some isolation buckets, and by the time that final buzzer rolled around, he probably had 30 on some of the best efficiency you'll ever see. I can't stress enough how absurdly efficient this guy was, and continues to be every year. In 2012 is when he made that big leap, and in 2013 he had his most efficient season ever at more than 11% ahead of league average true shooting. In 2014, he had his best overall scoring season where he was 9% ahead of average while leading the league at 32 points a game. From there, it's been smooth sailing of uber efficient scoring every single year, as he's made a name for himself as one of NBA history's greatest scorers. But when I think about which version of Durant was truly the best from purely a bucket-getting perspective, my mind immediately goes to that 3-year stretch he had right before his first foot injury. The way he put together the open floor and half-court game. The way he blended the off-ball brilliance with 3-level on-ball scoring, the athleticism, and the shooting. This was the most versatile scorer the game of basketball has ever seen. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and turn my post notifications on to be first on more content. If you're interested in my more in-depth research, make sure to check out my website and social media profiles. You can find those links in the description. Feel free to let me know down in the comments what you think of Durant. As always, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.